Hello and welcome back to CRJ 422. We're going to be covering Chapter 8 today, and we'll be discussing crowd violence. And like all violence, mob violence is not something that's unique to the United States. There has been records of mob violence going back hundreds of years. And so there has always been a concern or a curiosity as to what drives mob violence and the different types of mob violence. And to understand it, you kind of have to understand the definition and the difference between a mob and a crowd, and how those two interact when it comes to the concept of mob violence. Generally speaking, what we're talking about when we talk about mob violence are three different things. We're talking about riots, which recently we have seen as a result of police shootings, but can be as a result of any unifying incident that a large number of people react violently to. Lynch mobs, which we don't see in today's society as much anymore. However, if you're talking about during the civil rights movement in the 1960s, if you're talking about during the slave era and even after that during the Reconstruction era, if you're talking about during the Old West, those kinds of groups that would come together, the Ku Klux Klan is one that pops into mind. And then you have vigilante groups. And lynch mobs and vigilante groups oftentimes are fairly interchangeable, although there are some subtle differences between the two. Riots, for the most part, are typically the least planned and most spontaneous. They tend to congregate very quickly as a result of a particularly emotionally charged event, and then they tend to dissipate fairly quickly as well. Vigilante groups, on the other hand, tend to be the more planned and least spontaneous, because those are individuals who are going after somebody or a group of people for a specific reason. Because we're social creatures, we tend to live and work in groups. It's fairly uncommon to have somebody who doesn't have interaction with other people in society. And we want to be able to trust those individuals that we associate with. But there's something to the mob mentality and the psychology of what happens when you are involved in a group, and how easily things that you do can be changed by that group mentality. One of the fears, or one of the biggest fears about riots, is that oftentimes they target anybody and anything that happens to be in the wrong place. So if you look at the LA riots after Rodney King in the early 90s, what you found was that individuals who just happened to be in the wrong neighborhood would oftentimes become victims of that mob violence, even though they had nothing to do with the underlying cause of whatever kicked off that particular riot. Some of the reasons for violence have been suggested. There's 8 specific psychological factors that tend to allow people to more easily meld into mob violence and move from a peaceful crowd or peaceful organization into something more violent. And those are covered in the text. There's a couple of different types of crowds and mobs, and you can see how through those typologies they move from just a casual crowd, no big deal, down to an aggressive crowd, down to an aggressive mob, and how the progression works in those types of things. One of the things that, again, is discussed in the text and is a concern for researchers is the mob mentality, and how do people who are otherwise law-abiding citizens who would not under other circumstances be violent become violent and become dangerous when in a group of other people, and how those emotions feed off of one another, and people oftentimes do things within a mob setting or within a riot setting where they wouldn't normally do that kind of thing, but they're kind of egged on by the other individuals, and it's a cycle of one-upping each other until it gets to a violent stance. Riots are described within federal criminal code, and there are a number of different definitions that come across both federal and state laws. The text talks about some of the historic legislation that covers riot activities, and how those have progressed throughout history. The concept of lynchings and lynch mobs, and how some of those have grown throughout history, or at times were much more common and have since kind of dissipated. And the concept of vigilantism. And when we talk about vigilantism, no, we're not talking about Batman and some of the popularized vigilantes, but what we're talking about is individuals or organizations that take extra legal steps when they feel that the law is not acting or reacting to a situation in a manner that they would prefer. There's certain typologies that come about when discussing vigilante groups, and in some of those you're talking about vigilantism as it applies to criminals who they don't feel the justice system has punished appropriately. So throughout this chapter, again, we're going to be looking at history of mob violence and some of the more recent riots and group violence situations that have occurred, especially as a result of some of the more controversial shootings and things like that throughout the last couple of years, but also the historical basis that supports those. So make sure that you are keeping up with your reading, keeping up with your assignments. Certainly feel free to access the additional resources that are online. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in cyberspace.